Such a country where people didn't have food to eat. And there was so much poverty that people lost lives due to unavailability of food. There weren't any natural resources. Area-wise it's so small that even after zooming, people couldn't find it in world map. And talking about population, area-wise population was very large. There are 7,000 plus people per square km. In India, 430 people dwell in the same area. But this country did something due to which, within few years, it transforms from a poor country to one of the richest countries in the world. Earlier in this country, where people used to die due to poverty, today one among every 6 person is a millionaire. For GDP per capita it secures second place in the world. And it's number 1 in Asia. And all these things happened because of one person only whose name was Lee Kuan Yew, who changed the destiny of Singapore. And in today's video, you'll understand one thing properly. That if you elect a correct leader, then he'll help the country reach the top. So, this is the world map. There's a small point on the left of India. This is so small that even if you zoom the world map back to back, you'll still face difficulty in finding it. So, when it was zoomed, this is the mainland Singapore. There are small 64 islands beside it. Some are natural and some are artificial made by them. And there's one more thing, that Singapore is a city-state. Which means that Singapore is a country, which doesn't have city. Instead, the entire country is divided in different regions, like West Region, North Region. The total area of Singapore is 719 square kilometers. If we compare it to India then, it is 4,751 times smaller. Beside it, there's Malaysia and on the other side Indonesia. The border of Singapore is sea-bounded and its location has a great importance. This is Malacca Strait and the other is Sunda Strait. Strait word is used because it connects Indian Ocean and South China Sea with a narrow path. When two different seas or water basin is connected by a path, then it's called a strait. And it's not like this route is important in today's date. During the time of 7th century, this route was very important for the entire world. Because through these paths, East Asia and West Asia made their entire trade. 4 countries of Middle East, India, Europe, if anyone wanted to enter East Asia, or they had to deliver a package, they used these 2 routes. Because if anyone made another route and tried to enter, it took a long time. And Malacca Strait and Sunda Strait, even if they're compared, then Malacca Strait was a little smaller, that is why it was more often used in comparison to Sunda Strait. So, earlier in 7th century, there were not seaports but the king of Palembang and Sumatra. Dapunta Sri Jayanasa takes control of this area, and all the ships that passed through this route had to pay tax. Then with time, slowly their control gets weak, then more kings reign. So, there was a king Rajkumar Sangnila. During his reign in that area, one day he went for hunting. And from far away, he sees a Shing island which he likes so much. So, he goes to that island. And there he is told that this area is called Temasek. And at this particular place, he comes across an animal which he never saw before in his entire life. So, the people residing there tell the king that this animal is a lion or an animal named Singa, or looks like it. So, from then on the king names this area as Singapura. And in future, people started calling it Singapore, which means Lion City. In the current time, if you look at the national symbol of Singapore, is a lion's head. So, with time back-to-back kings reigned one after other and ruled in this area. But day by day, the importance of this route was increasing rapidly for traders. All the countries understood that the one who controls this particular area will gain a lot of profit. So keeping these things in mind, from year 1509-1511, Portuguese slowly took the Malacca Strait under their control. And they made small seaports in the area of Malacca Strait. By making seaport, when ships travel on a long route, they get a place to halt. If the ship had maintenance or something has to be repaired, everything was done here, and the area also develops a good business system which gains a lot profit. And now, looking at all these things, Dutch companies also face many difficulties. So, they felt that this way, they'll face huge loss. So, in year 1603 Dutch companies apply their forces, defeats Portuguese, and takes control over this area. And there were battles between Dutch and Portuguese to take control over this area. But Dutch had strong forces, so ultimately Strait of Malacca was entirely controlled by Dutch. Now on this side, they both were fighting, and on the other hand, British East India Company was ruling in India and making profit there. Along with it, they traded in South Asia as well. They made colonies even there as well. And they also required this route for trading. So, they also wanted to secure this route in one way or the other, but East India Company didn't want to directly fight with Dutch. So, East India Company leaves Strait of Malacca as it is, but in January 1819, British officer Thomas Stamford, besides Strait of Malacca, this area called Singapore, and Johar's Sultan controlled it. So it sends their officer here, and on 6 February, 1819, this Sultan of Johor is manipulated and made to sign a treaty. The treaty basically said that 8,000 Spanish dollars will be given to the Sultan by Britishers. And instead of that, the entire Singapore area will be under their control. Then they can do whatever they want. So, from here Britishers get Singapore, and Dutch made their seaports in Strait of Malacca. Now, the place where Singapore is in today's date, we can understand one thing. That how a well-structured business ecosystem can be a big advantage for progress of any country. And for this even our Prime Minister Narendra Modi praised Singapore. Bill Gates, Jack Ma, everyone did, and not only country, a well-planned business structure is required in every place from small to big businesses. Now, if all the departments of your business are not in sync and you're doing everything manually alone, then your business won't work at its full potential. And resources will be wasted differently. And if you're in such situation as well, then Odoo can help you in this. Odoo is a simple-to-use business management software that provides multiple apps to manage all the departments of your business, like website, sales, finance, inventory, and manufacturing. Our marketing, everything, and that too everything fully integrated at one place. The best thing is that you don't have to spend a lot. In fact, first app will always be free. And all the softwares can be used in a single fee by investing less money. And as your business grows, you can also add more apps. So check out Odoo, the link is in the description. So coming back to the topic, now they don't fight, but a competition had started in a way. Now the competition that starts changed the destiny of this small island Singapore due to it. Dutch companies in Strait of Malacca and East India companies in Singapore. They both tried that the area in their control. Lot of ships should stop at their place and to deal with competitions. East India Company starts developing huge seaports in Singapore, due to which infrastructure starts taking shape in Singapore. And the ports made by Britishers started giving extraordinary services, and to defeat the Dutch in competition, they announced that Singapore port is free of cost for every country's ship. Means on this port, there'll be zero tax for business-related activities. Now, when such announcement is made, ships of all the countries started coming more on this port. The strategy of East India Company behind this was that even though ships are coming to the port, they aren't taking tax, due to which they're facing loss. But if ships will come, then the overall Singapore trade will increase, due to which East India Company will make profit in long term. And there was another benefit for East India Company. This Singapore port had a very good coastal slope, means the slope of land and water was better. If this slope isn't good, then the ship would be at risk, due to which the Singapore port was people's first choice, and due to this China, India, Malaysia people came here from everything. Now because of which, Singapore, which was a deserted island, there the population of India, China and Malaysia starts migrating. And when people starts migrating here, then the problem here was that there wasn't any proper administration in Singapore. Britishers entirely focused on Singapore port security and making money in it. The population and people working there, they didn't have any interest their growth, development. Now since there wasn't any proper administration, caused illegal offenses to be start. Due to this, Singapore port was becoming more famous for its illegal offenses. People from different countries came here and took opium, played gambling, did slave trading. Commercial sex workers started operating here. Violence had increased very much. The traders entering this route saw Singapore as a home for all their illegal crimes. And Britishers took people working there as labor class. Laborers who worked hard in less money and they didn't have any interest in anything else. Now, after this, Britishers weren't earning as expected from that port. And there was a country called China near to it where Britishers saw that they're earning money. Because the sea beside China had many natural resources, which it was selling to the entire world, and even UK had to trade from there. Now looking at all those things, Britishers weren't happy with China as well. They felt that, we have to take so many things by giving them money. And we don't have anything that China requires. Actually, when trade takes place from both sides, only then countries make profit. To deal with it, Britishers owned a very weird way. They didn't have any product on which people of China would depend. So, Britishers identified a product, sent it to China. Made them addicted, and when people of China were addicted to it, they were more dependent on it. Then they started exporting it to China, and it was China's compulsion to import that product and buy it. And the name of that product was opium, that is afim. Due to this, the addiction of opium started increasing rapidly. Now, the addiction that had spread in China. Slowly, it had reached Singapore as well. Because mostly Singapore had mostly Chinese labor. If I give you the data of 1847, then till 1847, which was a deserted island, its population had increased to 70,000. Among which 40,000 were only Chinese, and among these population as well 15,000 people were addicted to opium. So, you can think, where so many people are addicted, what will happen on the streets? And the majority of population of Singapore were without any support and entertainment. They were working hard for Britishers in less money. That's why instead of being productive, they got addicted. Situation was such that as we asked guests for tea, in Singapore people offered opium like it was tea. Instead of money, people started giving opium to each other. They got so addicted to opium. And they didn't have money, for which they started stealing, loot and everything. They already had poverty, this was added on top of it, but after this one such thing happens as such, due to which the situation of Singapore gets a little better. Actually, in November 1869, Egypt's Suez Canal is opened. Earlier these two routes were used, due to which Sunda Strait and Malacca Strait both had their traffic divided. But when Suez Canal is opened, then traders use this route. Because this route was smaller for them. The only route from England to China became 5,000 miles less. Due to this, Strait of Malacca and Singapore gained a lot of importance. Now, from here the trade of Singapore trade booms. Traders start coming to Singapore from all over the world. The demand for manpower increases. All the people from neighboring countries of Singapore came to work there. And due to this, the population of Singapore also started increasing. And when population started increasing, then Britishers made rules and regulations as well. It was their compulsion to focus on administration. Police and soldiers were recruited. They had to create infrastructure for the needs of workers. Due to all these reasons, Singapore started evolving as a British colony, as a proper country. But in year 1914, World War starts. Singapore didn't had any relations with this war, but Britain was involved in it. Due to which, the focus of Britishers went towards the war, and secondly, due to this war, global trading had decreased. It faced huge impact. And Singapore, which was the trading hub of Europe and Asian countries, faces huge loss. People who worked in different ways at the Singapore port and earned money for food. Everything had halted for people. Unemployment had increased, food items were scarce, fights started taking place. The addiction of opium was already there, and along with it in year 1918, Spanish flu had spread in the entire world. Due to which Singapore was also captured in it and thousands of people lost their lives. After this, in year 1929, Great Depression had spread. So, from here things didn't lighten up for Singapore. In fact, in 1939, Second World War started as well. So, situation was worse here as well, but there was one thing. That Japan and Britain were against each other. So what Japan did was, on the 8th of February 1942, it attacked Singapore. And within 7 days, Japan Army defeated British Army, kills 1,000 of their soldiers. But after that, it enters Singapore and brutally starts killing. They kill the common people. There were mass killing in public place, people were burnt alive, forced labor. and many other tortures were imposed. At that time, whoever looked at the situation of Singapore, they couldn't even think that in future, Singapore will be in the list of world's richest countries. So, when Japan was making a brutal scene in the midst, in August 1945, America drops nuclear bomb on Japan, due to which, Japan faces huge loss. Japan surrenders. It even leaves Singapore and Britishers enter Singapore again. And this was the time when, people of Singapore were craving for even a slice of food. And when Britishers came again in Singapore, they made some changes. They understood that if there won't be any proper administration, then it'll also interfere in their port work as well. So, keeping this thing in mind, Britishers made administrative changes in Singapore and gave self-governance the people, as making government and hosting elections, appointing their leader. Domestic issue. Now, people of Singapore were taking the decisions themselves regarding their issues. But the international relation and security of Singapore were kept by Britishers. Now in year 1959, general election is held in Singapore. And total 51 seats were there for which elections are held. And Lee Kuan Yew, he enters an election by making People's Action Party and wins 43 seats out of 51. And he becomes the PM of Singapore. And this was the person who turns the fate of Singapore. Britishers were indulged in making money from Singapore port. On the other hand, Lee's vision changed the national, economical and social situation of Singapore. Due to which, until today's date, he's called founding father of the nation. And he did everything in a unique way which no one could catch up with, even today. Hope will try, but they don't become successful. Now, you can say that the location of Singapore is good, that's why it was possible. But location of Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand were also good, but in Singapore Prime Minister Lee performed such activity due to which, Singapore totally changed itself. What did he do? We'll discuss that as well. Now as soon as Lee Kuan Yew becomes the Prime Minister of Singapore, he knew that if Singapore doesn't stand up on its own, then Singapore will not be left as a country. Because he was afraid that, if the Britishers leave them, then nobody knew how to manage security and other things. And Chinese population was more in Singapore, so communist power like Soviet Union and communist China had their eyes on Singapore, that the elections that are held, the parties and PMs are elected, how would they remove them and establish communist government in Singapore? So, this was a challenge in front of PM Lee, but the bigger challenge was that in Singapore the level of poverty, slums, famine, opium addiction, crime and racial unrest that dwelled couldn't be found anywhere else in the world. At that time, unemployment was at its peak, food scarcity, but even after that every week a worker group would go on strike. People remained divided in Singapore, they only had relation with their community. Singapore as a nation didn't had any relation with each other. Everyone dealt with only their own community. And the area were divided community-wise, like the majority of Chinese population lived in the downtown area. Malaysian lived in Kampong Glam. Indians lived in Serangoon in majority. Now since the entire country wasn't united, it caused huge loss to Singapore. So, PM Lee firstly decided that they need to unite the entire country. Otherwise, if they'll bring any policy, it'll get wasted. As soon as he becomes PM, he created the national flag and national anthem of Singapore. Their national anthem is very small. Their currency had its engraved on its back. The entire national anthem gets covered in that small area. So, to deal with all these things, PM Lee on February 1960, the 70% population, which lived in slums, by making different communities for which to end, PM Lee establish Housing and Development Board HDB, which bought lands and made huge housing units and gave houses to those who lived in slums in very cheap. Those who didn't have money took in lease, and those who did job had their central provident fund deducted, and this fund could be available after retirement only. They couldn't withdraw it before. So they changed one thing, that if someone has medical emergency or want to withdraw money to build house, then they can. Now, with this, within few years slums were transformed into buildings. And purposely, government had allotted buildings in mixed population, so that people get united in the area in which they were living by making different communities. Had ended. Their PM knew that if they want to end the discrimination regarding religion, then they had to stop talking about any one religion or community. They'll have to create equal respect and opportunity for every religion. And if they've to end it, then they'll have to start in school level so that they need to end it in root level. At that time in Singapore, the children of Malay community would go to Malay school. Chinese kids went to Chinese school. Similarly, rest of the communities went to their preferred schools, so to deal with it, Lee started government schools with better infrastructure and facility than them, and offered this government schools in very less fee. And when people looked at the facilities and curriculum that in less fee there's good facility, there's good curriculum, then people preferred their kids from the community school to government schools, because they were getting high-class education in government school in less fee. And the focus of government was how to respect all the religions and live in unity. Even in fancy dress competitions, if there's a Chinese kid, then they would perform in Malay's traditional dress. So, they developed this type of culture in the school and teachers were instructed similarly. After this, their PM he formed Ministry of Culture. Its aim was to untie people. The cultural events that they hosted in multiple languages instead of one. And in some places, the Chinese would participate in Malay's cultural events. Similarly, Malay would participate in Chinese events. And the majority in Singapore belonged to Chinese, Malay, Tamil and English-speaking people. So, all these four languages were made official. Now, PM was successful in uniting the country, but the economy was dependent on tin and rubber products, which was controlled by Malaysia, because it was their biggest importer. With this, there weren't any natural resources in Singapore on basis of which they could make any money. And secondly, security was handled by Britishers. Suppose if the Britishers leave the country, then it would take 2 minutes for any country to end the existence of Singapore. So, their PM felt it in day one that if they'll have the support of Malaysia. And they also tried to make Malaysia happy, as they took Singapore of Malay origin. Malay was announced as the national language of Singapore. PM thought that this would make Malaysia believe that isn't a different country, but they're like our people, and if anything happens in near future, then they'll be in support. In fact, the PM of Singapore wanted Singapore to merge as its state. So these things were going on this side. Along with this, PM Lee also believed that all the plans that are being made in Singapore, people are united, different policies are being brought. All these plans will be unattended, if there'll be corruption. And regarding this, in June 1960, Prevention of Corruption Act was passed, in which public or government, in any sector, if anyone is caught in corruption, then they'll get penalty of 1 lakh Singapore dollar or 5-7 years of jail, or both can be imposed. To investigate these corruption cases, CPIB Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau was formed. And this entire department was kept out of the control of government. And its reporting was directly given to the Prime Minister. Now after this, in year 1961 he formed Economic Development Board EDB. Its main purpose was that even though we don't have natural resources, but if we give a good tax benefit, we'll have foreign investment in Singapore. Then the economy will revise and people will have both money and jobs. So, they decided that if anyone will come from outside and set up a new industry in Singapore, they'll be given tax benefit. In some cases, they'll be given tax holiday for even a couple of years. Means you can come, set up your company and you don't have to give tax for 1-2 years. PM Lee was taking these small steps, but along with it, parallelly he was meeting with Malaysia back to back. That Malaysia should make Singapore as a state. Their main aim was to end the fear of security. And they also believed that if Malaysia would merge with Singapore, then there are more industries. So the gross that'll be only of Singapore, with Malaysia it would increase and be better. By opening the Malaysian market, people would have more opportunities. And they'll earn more money. But they didn't want to impose their decision. They also wanted to know people's opinion. That what do people think about it? So in 1961, merger referendum bill was passed and all the people voted for merging Singapore with Malaysia. And then after this, Singapore and Malaysia is merged, in which Singapore had become the state of Malaysia, and the condition was that Singapore will be a state of Malaysia, and Singapore had to pay 40% of its annual revenue to Malaysian central government. Singapore will look into the education and labor rules itself, but defense, foreign affairs and security All these will be handled by Malaysian government. And along with it, the Parliament of Malaysia gave total 15 seats to Singapore. So PM Lee easily agrees to all these. And on the 16th of September 1963, Singapore officially became the state of Malaysia, which was country. Now, after this, on the 1st of March 1964, Singapore, which was already a state of Malaysia, Lee said that his party PAP will participate in Malaysia general election. Now this was the first time the Malaysian government started facing little difficulties. Because Singapore had both Malay and Chinese population. So they felt that the political party of Singapore wants to enter an election and be in power, leaving behind their political party. And all these things were going on, but along with it, on the 21st of July 1964, Malaysian Muslims were celebrating the birthday of Hazrat Muhammad, and at the same time, they get in conflict with Chinese Muslims in Singapore, and the situation fuels up so much that riots took place. 23 people lost their lives and hundreds of people get injured, and it doesn't stop here. 1 month later, again the Muslims and Chinese cause riots. And when all these things were discussed in Malaysia, then Malaysian government takes to Lee and explains Lee that Malaysia belongs to Malay people, favor them and it'll have political advantage, and keep the Chinese somewhat behind. Now Lee directly declines it. He says that we're working for years on it, uniting them, and it's not right to make them fight. Every religion is same for us. Now, from here, Malaysian government understood that they made a mistake in merging Singapore with them. Because they aren't listening to us, and in future, our political interests would suffer. So, they put Lee and rest of the Singaporean leaders in prison, but then, after some time, Malaysian PM Tunku Abdul Rahman interferes and on the 9th of August 1965 separates Singapore from Malaysia. They removed the state they made and leaves Singapore alone. Singapore is the only country of the world which was forcefully given freedom. Lee hosts a press conference on the same day and announces Singapore as a democratic and independent country, the Republic of Singapore. But they didn't want to be separated from Malaysia. In fact, when he was doing the press conference, even at that time, he cried. But after some time, understood that nobody will come to save Singapore. Whatever is to be done, they'll have to do themselves. On this side, these things were going on. Along with it, another problem emerges. Actually, Britishers were calculating. They were also conducting elections. By looking at their loss, they decide that their military expenses would be reduced, and along with it, the colonies where they gained less profit and suffered immense loss, they'll leave those places. And then on the 18th of July 1967, Britishers decide that Southeast, including Singapore, they'll leave them. All the soldiers will be called back, and until year 1970 from Southeast, they call back their army entirely. Now, this matter worried Lee and all the Singaporean people because British Army didn't only give security to the people of Singapore but also employment, due to which they could have food on their table. And PM Lee didn't have an immediate option with which he could employ so many people together. Lee goes to London and requests a lot, but nothing works, and Britishers easily leave Singapore. Now at that time, Singapore is left entirely alone. The little employment left was reduced. The situation of Singapore worsened in security. They only had 2 battalions of 1,000 men, 2 ships and no air force. But still, they make their own armed force. They managed to move forward. Now after this, Lee faced do or die situation. Lee starts taking back-to-back step. Firstly, Lee talks back-to-back with Southeast Asian countries, and Association of Southeast Asian Nations was formed, in which Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines and Thailand along with Singapore are connected so that all of them support each other economically and maintain the peace in the region, and if anyone faces a difficulty, then they would support them. Next step, in June 1968, Lee forms Jurong Town Corporation Act. Jurong is Singapore's West Region area. Lee decides that this area will be transformed into an industrial hub, where companies of other countries will come here and set up their companies. Now the question is, why would other countries leave everything and set up their companies here? So, Singapore's PM Lee had released many offers, like they made many industries tax-free. Some industries were given tax holiday that for few years, they wouldn't have to think about tax. They would come here and set up their companies and employ our citizens. Along with it, such labor laws were made which didn't exist anywhere in world means. Everything was in the favor of companies. The control of labor companies had the most control of Singaporean labor. People were immersed in poverty, so they didn't back out from doing labor. And Lee hold meeting back to back with USA, Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia, Australia and European companies and gets them to agree and set up companies in Singapore. Within 2 years, more than 150 companies come to Singapore and more than 32,000 jobs are created. Even after this, they started setting up big oil refining industries. And did it in this way, that Singapore became world's third oil refining center. So, these small incidents led to the end of Singapore's dependency on Malaysia because PM Lee created many jobs in Singapore. Now while the year 1970 arrives, they achieved what Lee wanted. Like until year 1970, none of the people were left unemployed. In fact, so many jobs were created that they had to call people from outside. And the GDP growth rate of Singapore had reached 13.9%, which was 3 times comparatively more than India. But then comes the time when Singapore had to enter among world's richest countries. Actually, in Singapore, many orders were created, even after calling people were outside the work couldn't be completed. Even after doing overtime, people couldn't achieve the delivery of the orders. So, PM Lee called his officials and said that the product manufacturing companies which requires laborious work, like textiles, wood products, mosquito coils, the focus on them requires lot of labor and hard work and less money. If it continues, then whatever business comes, our growth will stop here itself. So, now they need to do something which requires less work and helps gain more money. Make such policy due to which technology and skill-based industries like machinery, electronic parts, computer parts, pharma-based companies should also invest because this requires less work and helps gain more money. And after working on it for some time, in year 1973 their Economic Development Board, EDB, announces that the investors will set up high technology industry. Don't need to take up tension until 5 years in Singapore. Until 5 years, they don't need to give any money in form of tax. They offered it to foreign companies. Secondly, their own companies were told that if anyone will upgrade machinery and staff, improve technology, then they'll also get tax incentive. Companies started coming and demand for skillful workers increased. Now, since without technological knowledge, the workers of Singapore couldn't get jobs, so for that as well, along with MNCs, they opened joint industrial center in which without theoretical knowledge, they gave training of hands-on and people started learning it quickly. Along with it, they did one more thing which turned out be game changer. Actually, based on the economy of any country, banks give interest to their customer. So, at that time, Singapore's economic growth was increasing rapidly. So, the interest in banks that were given were high in amount. Singapore became one of the countries in the world which gave high bank interests. Normally, in such cases that bank gives high interest in a country, then lot of foreign banks also invest in them, but in Singapore, the interest that they got from banks, almost 45%, was taken up by government, due to which foreign banks weren't showing much interest in Singaporean banks. So, looking at it, PM Lee says that we need to end this as well. The 45% of tax that the government used to take, stop entirely. And this one strategy benefits Singapore a lot. Foreign banks invested so much in Singaporean banks that Singapore became international financial center. Even after that, Lee doesn't stop. He says that now they need to take one more step. So, they noticed that their workers in Singapore are making high technology products but are of low value. Means they're making less profit. So with this, along with high technology, he tells people to make high value products, so that more money is earned in less hard work. PM Lee dreamt of making Singapore as world's richest country. Now, think that few years ago, 20-25 years where earlier poverty prevailed, he was dreaming so big and he was even completing it. So, he started many incentives for what was decided. And in 1980 government brought a high salary scheme in which skillful laborers were announced high salary according to their skill. The foreign industries which made high-value products were given tax discount like before. And even more. Government made skill development fund in their budget separately so that the companies of their country, the training, R&D, computerization, automation, the high-end products that could be developed, they invested in it. So that they get subsidy, and they did it successfully. That Singapore became king of high-value product manufacturing in the world. In 1993, Singapore became the largest exporter of hard disks used in computer. Singapore was advancing its country back to back. They were doing these things, but along with it they topped in tourism, transport and communication. Brain services. PM Lee created infrastructure projects like Singapore Botanical Garden, Sentosa Island, Mass Rapid Transit System (MRT) system, and Singapore Science Parks, and many more infra projects which gained name of Singapore in entire world. And if we talk about current date, Singapore's name is counted in one of the world's top safest, cleanest and beautiful countries, where best and affordable healthcare is available. With 97% literacy. There's top-class education system, along with most efficient public transport. World's best airport is there. Their GDP per capita is $127,606 United States dollars, which comes second in the world and number one in Asia. One among every 6 person is a millionaire. Within few years, Singapore is among world's most expensive cities. Corruption and crime is almost negligible. Here, connecting Wi-Fi without asking, public smoking, crossing road without crosswalk, which is called zebra crossing, in spreading trash, on eating chewing gum or selling them, even on not flushing in public toilet. On every such thing, a good amount of fine will be imposed and can be sentenced to jail. And even if you're found involved in the case of drugs, harsh punishment is given. Even in today's date. There are so many countries which copy the system of Singapore. But even after that they can't become like Singapore. Because the core isn't focused on, which is people's unity and zero corruption. PM Lee didn't had time to do politics and think about his long term. He thought of long term, that if Singapore doesn't stand on its own, then the country wouldn't survive. When the country wouldn't survive, then what will he do by saving his position? And this was the reason everyone talks about PM Lee even today. At last, let me tell you again, if you're a business owner, then to organize your business, use Odoo. I've given the link in description. Thank you.